Do you remember when you were little? You could do the simplest thing. Smile, make a sound, say a random word. And suddenly, everyone around you would laugh, praise you, and shower you with attention and praise. And without realizing it, some of us became attached to that feeling. We started associating approval with worth, validation with happiness, praise with love. Over time, we slowly began treating other people's opinions as if they were the final measure of our value. As if our success, confidence, and fulfillment could only exist once someone else confirmed it for us. But in doing that, we created our own prison and then handed the key to everyone else. Because if your happiness depends on other people's approval, then your peace is no longer yours. It belongs to the crowd, to society, to strangers, to expectations that constantly change.
But isn't that the definition of misery? Living a life where your emotional state is controlled by people who were never meant to define you in the first place. How different would life feel if you were truly your own person? If you decided what success meant for you, what happiness meant for you, what kind of life was meaningful to you, instead of blindly following the standards handed to you by society, family, or the internet? Throughout life, we often convince ourselves that the pain we feel comes from failure, rejection, obstacles, or difficult circumstances. But today, we will dive into this ideology by breaking down the ideas in the book The Courage to Be Disliked by Ichiro and Fumitakekoga. The true source of unhappiness runs much deeper. As they explain,
this concern for others' opinions is the root of your unhappiness. No matter how much progress we make, no matter how much we achieve, the desire to be admired, accepted, or seen as good enough in the eyes of others can become addictive to the point of self-destruction. You begin performing instead of living, comparing instead of appreciating, hiding parts of yourself just to remain likable. And eventually, you stop asking yourself what truly makes you happy and start shaping your life around what keeps you accepted. Kishimi and Koga argue that what we call internal struggles are rarely truly internal. Most anxiety, insecurity, and emotional suffering are connected to our relationships with other people.
they explain, there is no such thing as worry that is completely defined by the individual. Whatever worry may arise, the shadows of other people are always present. In other words, many of the battles happening inside your mind are actually social at their core. Fear of judgment, fear of rejection, fear of not being enough, fear of being disliked. And because of that fear, many people spend their entire lives chasing approval without ever feeling fulfilled by it. So how do you actually achieve that? How do you detach yourself from the opinions of others and finally build a life that feels peaceful, meaningful, and genuinely happy? According to the ideas of Ichiro and Fumitakekoga, every person has the ability to become happy, regardless of what happened in their past. The difference between happy and unhappy people is not talent, luck, or circumstances. It is the willingness to act. Their book, The Courage to Be Disliked, is heavily influenced by the ideas of Alfred Adler.
Adler was a medical doctor and psychotherapist, and founder of the school of individual psychology. Unlike many psychologists of his time who focused mainly on trauma or unconscious drives, Adler believed that human beings are shaped more by the meaning they give to their experiences and the goals they pursue in the present. He argued that people are not trapped by their past, but are constantly choosing who they become through their actions, beliefs, and relationships with others.
At the center of Adler's philosophy is the idea that many human struggles come from interpersonal relationships and the desire to find belonging, significance, and value within society. Adler believed that human beings are not fragmented creatures driven by random emotions or unconscious impulses. He saw the self as a unified whole, where thoughts, emotions, behavior, and even unconscious patterns all work together toward a purpose. According to Adler, every action we take serves a goal, even when we are unaware of it ourselves. Adler also argued that goals shape identity. Rather than focusing on fixed personality traits, he believed people create what he called a lifestyle, a pattern of habits, emotions, thoughts, and behaviors chosen over time because they seem useful for achieving a certain goal. Kishimi and Koga expand on this idea by suggesting that emotions themselves are often created in service of those goals. First, a person decides what they want, and then the mind produces emotions that help move them toward that outcome. For example, imagine someone who says they want to start creating art, posting videos, or sharing their work online. But every time they are about to begin, they suddenly feel overwhelmed by self-doubt. They overthink every detail, convince themselves they are not talented enough, and eventually decide not to post anything at all. Most people would assume their insecurity is the obstacle stopping them, but Kishimi and Koga would argue that something deeper is happening beneath the surface. They would say the person's true goal may not actually be success. The real goal may be avoiding criticism, embarrassment, or the possibility of being judged by others. In that case, insecurity becomes useful because it provides a reason to stay hidden and avoid the emotional risk that comes with putting yourself out there. From this perspective, emotions are not always random forces controlling us. Sometimes they become unconscious tools we use to protect ourselves from outcomes we fear.
Kishimi and Koga also challenge one of the most common beliefs people have about happiness, the idea that the past permanently defines who we are. Many people believe their trauma, childhood experiences, failures, or painful memories are the reason they cannot move forward. While the authors do not deny that suffering leaves an impact, they argue that experiences themselves do not determine a person's future. What truly shapes a life is the meaning someone gives to those experiences. Two people can go through similar pain and still end up living completely different lives. One person may use hardship as a reason to stop trying, while another may use it as motivation to grow stronger. According to Adler's philosophy, the difference lies in the goal each person chooses afterward. Kishimi and Koga explain this through a powerful idea. Human beings are not simply controlled by causes from the past, but driven by purposes in the present. In other words, people often act according to the outcome they are trying to achieve now, not just because of what happened to them years ago. That is why they reject the idea that trauma alone permanently traps someone in unhappiness. They argue that people sometimes continue holding on to painful identities because those identities serve a purpose. A person who constantly says, "I can't change because of what happened to me," may unknowingly be protecting themselves from the risk and responsibility that change requires. This does not mean pain is fake or insignificant. Their point is that suffering does not automatically decide the course of your life forever.
As Adler himself believed, we are not determined by our experiences, but by the meaning we assign to them. And that idea completely changes the way happiness is viewed. Because if your life is not controlled entirely by your past, then it means your future is still open. It means the person you become is not decided by what happened to you, but by the choices you continue making now. According to the book, happiness begins the moment a person stops asking, "What did life do to me?" and starts asking, "How do I want to live from this point forward?" So if happiness is something people can choose, then why do so many remain unhappy for years? Temporary unhappiness is a normal part of life. Everyone experiences disappointment, loneliness, frustration, or failure at times. But people who remain deeply unhappy often share one thing in common. They organize their lives around a frustrating goal connected to other people. This is where Adler's famous idea becomes central again,
that many human problems are rooted in interpersonal relationships. Kishimi and Koga argue that the goals people set within their relationships shape nearly every part of their emotional life. The question is not simply whether you have relationships, but what you are trying to gain from them. Are you trying to be respected, admired, accepted, needed, approved of? The answer to that question influences your emotions, your confidence, and even your sense of self-worth. According to the book, there are two main directions people tend to follow in relationships. One is the pursuit of approval. The other is the desire to contribute positively to the lives of others.
Many unhappy people make approval their highest priority. They believe happiness comes from being seen as valuable by others, whether that approval comes from parents, friends, society, or even strangers online. As a result, their emotional well-being becomes dependent on outside judgment. Kishimi and Koga argue that the real problem begins when approval becomes the foundation of your identity. Once that happens, your sense of worth no longer belongs to you. It is determined by others. From childhood, many people are taught to connect love, acceptance, and value with performance through praise and criticism. As adults, they continue living as if they are being graded by the world. They choose careers to impress others, hide parts of themselves to avoid criticism, and constantly worry about how they are perceived.
Eventually, they stop asking what kind of life is meaningful to them and start shaping themselves around what earns the most approval. The result is a deeply unfree way of living, because when your happiness depends on being liked, your life becomes controlled by something you can never fully control: other people's opinions. Kishimi and Koga argue that seeking approval does not only damage your confidence, it also slowly takes away your freedom. The moment your happiness becomes dependent on being liked, your behavior starts revolving around other people's expectations. Instead of making decisions based on what feels meaningful to you, you begin adjusting yourself to avoid criticism, rejection, or disapproval. You stop speaking honestly because you fear upsetting people. You avoid taking risks because failure might make you look foolish. You constantly analyze how others perceive you, hoping to maintain an image that keeps you accepted. Over time, this creates a life that feels emotionally exhausting because you are no longer living according to your own values. You are living according to invisible standards set by everyone around you.
Kishimi and Koga explain that many people call this a desire for recognition, but beneath it lies something deeper: the fear of being disliked. As long as someone fears disapproval, true freedom is impossible. Living freely means accepting that no matter what you do, some people will misunderstand you, criticize you, or simply dislike you. There is no way around that reality. Trying to avoid it only traps a person in endless self-monitoring and people-pleasing. The authors also make an important point about praise. While praise seems positive, it still places your worth in someone else's hands. The moment you depend on praise to feel valuable, you begin adapting yourself to fit another person's standards of what is good. That is why approval can become addictive. The more someone depends on external validation, the more disconnected they become from their own judgment. Eventually, many people realize that no amount of approval ever feels permanent. No matter how much validation someone receives, there will always be another expectation to meet, another comparison to win, or another person whose approval still feels out of reach. When people realize they cannot satisfy everyone, many give up completely. But instead of letting go of the need for approval, they often turn their frustration inward. They begin believing something about them is fundamentally flawed.
Some convince themselves they are unattractive, unworthy, socially awkward, untalented, or incapable of being loved. Kishimi and Koga argue that these beliefs often become emotional excuses that protect people from risking rejection again. Because if someone already believes they are hopeless, they no longer have to face the uncertainty of trying. But this creates an even deeper form of unhappiness.
The person remains emotionally controlled by the same goal they were trying to escape, the desire to be accepted by others. They may stop chasing approval outwardly, but their self-worth is still being measured through other people's eyes. According to Kishimi and Koga, the need for approval not only damages confidence, but also harms relationships. One reason is that approval turns life into a competition.
When someone bases their worth on recognition, other people's success starts feeling threatening. Instead of seeing others as companions, they begin seeing them as rivals. If someone becomes more successful, attractive, or admired, it can feel as though their own value has decreased. This happens because approval is conditional. As a result, people trapped in validation compare themselves endlessly. Eventually, another person's success starts feeling like your failure. Instead of celebrating others, unhappy people may become jealous of them. Instead of feeling inspired, they may secretly feel relieved when others struggle. Kishimi and Koga argue that this happens because validation turns human relationships into a constant struggle for worth and recognition.
People who spend their lives trying to satisfy others often expect the same effort in return. They begin believing their kindness should earn appreciation, loyalty, or emotional repayment. For example, imagine someone who is always available for their friends, constantly helping and supporting them, only to feel hurt when that same energy is not returned. Over time, their kindness turns into frustration. The authors explain that this happens because many acts of generosity are not purely about helping others. Sometimes they are unconscious attempts to gain love, validation, or recognition in return. When those expectations are not met, relationships begin filling with disappointment and pressure instead of genuine connection. So if chasing approval leads to insecurity, competition, and resentment, what is the alternative?
According to Kishimi and Koga, truly happy people stop making recognition their main goal and instead focus on contribution. Rather than asking, "Do people approve of me?" they ask, "Am I bringing something meaningful to the lives of others?" The authors argue that real happiness comes from feeling useful, from believing your existence has value beyond praise or admiration. The important distinction is that contribution is completely different from people-pleasing. People-pleasing is driven by fear and depends on receiving approval in return. Contribution comes from freely choosing to give without making your worth dependent on how others respond. That is why happy people are less controlled by other people's opinions. As long as they believe they are contributing positively, they no longer need constant recognition to feel valuable. Kishimi and Koga also explain that every person must decide for themselves what being useful means. For one person, it may come through art, friendship, teaching, creating, helping family, or simply being emotionally present for others. Once someone finds meaning in contribution, approval becomes far less important because their sense of value no longer depends on outside judgment. The authors even argue that helping others is not a form of noble self-sacrifice. In many cases, people contribute because it genuinely fulfills them and gives their life meaning. According to the authors, there is nothing wrong with that. In fact, they believe contribution motivated by genuine fulfillment is far healthier than pretending to be selfless simply to appear like a good person in the eyes of others. Because once again, even self-sacrifice can become another hidden form of seeking approval. Kishimi and Koga believe that one of the biggest reasons people suffer is because they tie their worth to achievement, recognition, or comparison. Many people live as though they must constantly prove they deserve happiness. They believe they need more success, admiration, or accomplishments before they can finally feel valuable. But the authors reject this idea completely. They argue that human beings already have value simply because they exist. A person does not become worthy only after reaching some extraordinary standard. Even imperfect,
insecure or lost people can bring meaning and comfort to others simply through their presence. Because of this, happy people do not see life as a competition.
Someone else's success does not reduce their value. Another person's talent, attractiveness, or popularity does not make them less worthy. Rather than feeling threatened by other people's growth, they can celebrate it without feeling diminished themselves. Kishimi and Koga also explain that happiness is not waiting at the end of life after every goal has been achieved. Many people spend years thinking, I'll be happy when I succeed, when I become respected, or when my life finally looks perfect. But according to the book, that mindset keeps people trapped in the future. Real happiness is found in the present moment, in finding meaning in the life you are already living while continuing to move forward.
This does not mean abandoning ambition or refusing to improve yourself. The point is that your entire life should not become a waiting room for happiness.
Ultimately, this is why Kishimi and Koga say that happiness requires courage. The moment you stop living for approval, some people will misunderstand you. Some may judge you, reject you, or dislike the person you become. But trying to avoid disapproval from everyone is what keeps so many people trapped in fear. The authors believe true freedom begins when you accept that being disliked by some people is unavoidable and choose to live according to what genuinely feels meaningful to you anyway. That is the courage to be disliked.